everyone, and welcome to Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. I'm Rob, and today we're joined by Dr. Daise, endowed professor of Judaic Studies and chair of the Religious Studies Department at the College of William and Mary. Welcome to Church Coffee.
Great to be here. Thank you, Rob.
First and foremost, I see that we both have our coffee mugs. How do you take your coffee? What are you drinking currently?
This was the most important question for me. No sugar, but lots of extra cream is the way I take it. In fact, I used
Heavy cream, half and half, whole milk.
Half and half. Yeah, full half and half. In fact, I used to teach guitar at a guitar studio, and the head of the studio would order coffee every afternoon. After a while, he stopped ordering coffee light for me, and he started ordering milk dark. That's how light I like it. So
before we jump into a little biography of yourself, you said you used to teach at a guitar school. What type of guitar do you play, and what is a favorite song that you like to play?
And a favorite song. Okay. I started my career actually going into the biographical stuff. I started my career as a jazz guitarist, and my first year and a half of undergrad credit was at a place up in Boston called Berklee College of Music. I started this, I got into it junior year of high school. I left it for various reasons to go into first ministry and then the professoriate. But once I got tenure, my wife said, get a hobby or find a new wife. And so I've picked it up again, but doing the same thing by studying classical guitar. So favorite song, the one I've been working on now is Miles Davis' tune called Nardis, which is a fantastic tune. And it poses loads of challenges if you want to improvise. And so whenever I get the chance to play and to practice, I've been working on that. And I'd say that's probably favorite in my mind right now.
We've already touched on some of your interests, but tell us your story. Tell us a little bit of your personal history.
As I was developing a career in jazz guitar, and I grew up in Jersey, so I was right outside the city and was looking to break into the jazz scene then. At the same time, there was a Bible study that had incorporated into a church that had asked me if I would want to be on full-time as training and then ultimately clergy. And so I did that. I made a switch from one to the other. And I was in the pastoral ministry for about 10 years.
What denomination?
It was just non-denominational. And it has since gone the way of all the earth. It's no longer existent. But as I began to get theological education doing that, that tapped into something else that had been working in me, and that is a love of the ancient world, which I actually got from my mom. And so between Bible being ancient literature and my affinity for Greeks and Romans and things that ancient Greece, ancient Rome, I found that my gifts were better suited to scholarship than the pastorate. And so I went on, finished my PhD at Princeton Theological Seminary under a James Charlesworth, who is one of the leading figures in understanding early Christianity in light of Second Temple Judaism.
What did you do your dissertation
on? It's funny. James Charlesworth is typically known for his research in non-canonical literature. But by the time I got there, he was very interested in the Gospel of John. He led a tremendous seminar one semester on the Gospel of John. And so I worked with him writing on the Gospel, on the fourth Gospel. And I've since written 2 monographs on that, more or less using the orientation I learned from him about treating it as really early Jewish literature. And so that's where I came out on all of that.
You said you're tenured. Oh, excuse me. You said you're tenured, so give us a little biography of your time through academia.
Right. About a year after finishing my PhD, I applied for and received a tenure track position at the College of William and Mary. And I've been there since 2001. My tenure was around 2007, 2008, and my promotion was a couple of years ago. So one of the things I appreciate about what the department did, they had seen the need for somebody to teach to span is a dream job, someone to span Christian origins and Second Temple Judaism, which was right in my wheelhouse. By the grace of God, I've got that position. And so I've been able to teach there Second Temple Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, Christian origins, primarily in the New Testament area, and then also patristics. And that covers what they call formative Judaism and Christian origins. And I've been doing that since 2001.
And that is the reason we're speaking today. So let's jump into let's jump into historical Jesus and more Q&A to follow. What are the sources scholars work with when doing research on a 2,000-year-old figure? The Gospels obviously is, but which one is considered the most historical? And I guess asked in another way, what gospel do academics use the most when working on the historical Jesus? Or even more specifically, what gospel would you work on? Sounds like possibly the Gospel of John, but give us both and.
Now, initially, just to give a little backstory and some historical development on this, for various reasons, the Gospel of John for the longest time was marginalized. Just two to give out of many reasons. One is that it's very otherworldly. Jesus speaks, even John the Baptist and the narrator speak in an otherworldly type of parlance. That in itself seems as if it's somewhat removed from historical reality and probably more theological contemplation than it is history. And so that is one of the reasons it had long remained suspect. The other is it has what in theology is called often a high Christology. That is, Jesus may indeed be considered and assumed to be God in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four canonical Gospels. In the Gospel of John, this is straight out from the beginning. In the beginning was the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. That comes out straight. And so it was thought that for Jesus to be considered a deity and presented as such so explicitly would have taken time. And so the Gospel of John at some points in history was actually dated to the 2nd century rather than the 1st. And so it was moved out of consideration, and early on the Gospels that were used were Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Second part of this is that within Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's a certain challenge that comes up that doesn't come up when you compare them with John. And that is, though they have slight differences with each other in the way they tell the story, they mostly tell the same story. And in some cases, if you look at the Greek, it's in identical language. Now, it's possible that you had 3 independent authors or 3 independent communities that came up with 3 independent stories that were that similar. But it's more probable, this is what has been thought, it's more probable that one of the 3 wrote first, and that the other 2 had that first one in front of them when they were writing. And this is called typically the synoptic problem. And so there have been theories over time as to which one of the 3 would be first. Would it be Matthew, in which case it would be called a theory of Matthean priority? That is, Matthew would have written first, and Mark and Luke would have depended upon Matthew. And therefore, Matthew being the earliest would be the one, to get to your question, would be the one you want to use for looking at Jesus historically. But the one that has really won the day, right or wrong, since the mid-19th century has been the Gospel of Mark. And so within the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Everyone usually works, there's only a few that don't, usually works on a hypothesis of Markan priority, meaning that Matthew and Luke are dependent, and therefore it was thought for a while, therefore, because they were dependent, they were not as reliable historically. There's one other complication here and I hope I'm not confusing too much. It also began to be noticed that if you say that Matthew and Luke depended upon Mark, there are passages in Matthew and Luke which are almost identical to each other, Matthew and Luke, but which are not found in Mark. And therefore, you can't account for it by saying they depended upon Mark, because it's not in Mark. There's various ways of construing that or figuring out a theory for that. But the one, again, that has won the day is that there was another source that has since been lost, and that Matthew and Luke, besides depending upon Mark, were also dependent upon this other source. And that's where you get those added sections in Matthew and Luke. Now, the German word for source is Quelle. And so this was simply called Quelle, or short, Q, the Q gospel. And so a long way about, but to get to your question, up until recent times, the way of approaching the sources for the historical Jesus are to look for Mark and Q. And when you look at Q, you don't look at it in as if it's in conjunction with Mark. And the same thing, Mark not in conjunction with Q. You look at them at separate sources. It has been believed by many, and is to this day, that when doing that, you're working with the earliest sources we have. A long answer to a short question, but that's essentially in the Gospels the way it has been working. I should say one more thing, that's breaking apart now. That scholars are beginning to recognize that even if Matthew and Luke depended upon Mark and Q, the reason they may have done was because they could attest independently to what Matthew or Q were saying. When you read historical Jesus literature now, scholars are far more apt to look at Matthew and Luke than they would have been, say, 50 years ago. And if I could just add one more thing, the Gospel of John is making its way back in. First of all, it's been recognized that you can account for the high Christology in the Gospel of John within early Judaism at the time of Jesus. For instance, there was a Jewish philosopher in Alexandria named Philo, who combined a study of Torah with Platonic philosophy, using what was known at the time as Middle Platonism. And Middle Platonism, without going too much into detail, it took the idea of logos from Stoicism and plugged it into Platonism, so that the logos, and this is found in Philo, the logos could be considered a second deity who was the communication between the deity and the sense-perceptible world. That was all in place before Jesus even became a public figure. So you don't need to say that the Gospel of John is so late it can't be used. And so now the Gospel of John is really making its way back. My own dissertation advisor that I mentioned before, James Charlesworth, was instrumental in doing that. Particularly significant has been a group called the John, Jesus, and History Group, led by a colleague, Paul Anderson, in the Society of Biblical Literature, which has for years been exploring the historicity in John and trying to show scholars that we need not shy away from it when doing historical Jesus research. When you're talking about the canonical Gospels, that's more or less the state of things.
Scholars used to date John to the 2nd century. It's my understanding that all 4 Gospels are now dated, albeit with some degree of probability, but all within the 1st century. Is that correct?
Precisely. Mark is considered just prior to the destruction of the temple around 68, because there doesn't seem to be a great awareness or concern about the destruction of the temple in Mark as you would have, for instance, in Luke. Matthew and Luke are usually dated to the mid-80s, and John when you get to the 90s. I'm not so sure myself that I would date John that late, but that's consensus.
Well, give us your own personal academic opinion. How much earlier do you think John might have been able to have been written?
In its current form, I'm becoming very convinced that the prologue to the Gospel of John, which is this wonderful hymn to the Logos, that it is done by a follower of Jesus who is coming out of Middle Platonism. And Middle Platonism had been around in Alexandria for about half a century prior to this. So I could easily date John into the 70s, 80s. Now, there's some aspects of John that are very aware of the destruction of the temple. So I don't want to go too early. I think that John, in its dating, should be considered at least along the lines of Matthew and Luke, and not sent out there by Pluto in the outer rim of the solar system.
Very interesting. I think we will get more into the Gospel of John in a little bit, but we're going to stay on historical Jesus for the moment. What are some other sources used for research in the historical Jesus outside of the canonical Gospels? New Testament writings, early church father epistles, Roman Jewish historians. Give us kind of greatest hits.
Greatest hits. Well, hit number one is the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. He was a historian who was born 37 CE, so a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And we think his death was around 100 CE. He had a brilliant career politically and as a priest and as a Pharisee, but it ended up that his primary contribution, at least as far as we're concerned, is that after the destruction of the temple, he was moved to Rome and became an historian and wrote 4 works on Second Temple Judaism. And those works are gold when it comes to anything regarding Christian origins, but certainly to Jesus of Nazareth. Now, first of all, Josephus himself has sections on, he himself deals with John the Baptist, Jesus, and James, the brother of Jesus. The passage on Jesus is subject to a lot of controversy because it's very possible that parts, if not all of it, were inserted there by later Christian scholars, scribes. But there's actually parts of Josephus where directly you could relate to figures of Christian origins, if not Jesus himself, those closely related to him. But the other part, and this is where it broadens out for the rest of Jewish literature at the time, is that there's a sense that in order to understand Jesus, you don't just look at sources which are narratives of his life or collections of sayings that he might have said. You look at context. And Josephus, it's almost like a day-by-day, blow-by-blow account of what was going on in first century Judaism. So Josephus is one of those sources. More broadly, literature of Second Temple Judaism, and I'll just give you an example of one of the more salient ones. And this is one, again, that gives us context, but not direct accounts of any figures of Christian origins, and that is discovery popularly known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, in the Judean desert, in the mid to late 20th century, there were a number of, I think I counted 10, 12 sites that were discovered that yielded scrolls from the ancient times. When the Dead Sea Scrolls are mentioned, however, it's usually referring to one of those, which is at a place called Khirbet Qumran on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. And Khirbet means ruins in Arabic. Qumran, I think there's loads of debates of what it might mean, but it's a site on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea where there is an installation of some kind of building structures that had been there. And from 1947 to 1956, in the caves in the hills surrounding it, particularly 11 of those caves, there were found artifacts and particularly scrolls that went back to Second Temple Judaism. The latest of them would have been in the 1st century CE, but the earliest go back to the 3rd century BCE. Some of those were what we would call biblical manuscripts, and by Bible we mean Bible in the Jewish sense, what Christians might call Old Testament. They were important because they gave us data that preceded our previous manuscripts by a millennium. Also, they had there was manuscripts from what's known as Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha, that is Jewish literature that we had known about that was written at the time, but never included in the Hebrew canon. But the payoff for historical Jesus particularly is some of those manuscripts were the writings of a Jewish sect themselves, maybe one, maybe several. And the sect seems to be very much like what Josephus, the historian that I just mentioned, describes as Essenes. Most scholars now will take an Essene hypothesis, which says that the group expressing themselves in the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents are probably have some affiliation with Essenes. This has been fascinating. Just to give you a couple of examples of how this could work. Let me see. For instance, when you read in all 4 of the canonical Gospels, John the Baptist is introduced, and his remit, his purpose is described using Isaiah 40, verse 3. Voices calling, prepare the way of the Lord, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. That same verse is actually used for the purpose of this sect. And so it has in one of their key documents. And so this has been, again, very significant in understanding John the Baptist in his relationship to Jesus and what his purpose might have been. Another, just to give you some examples of this, in that same document, which is called the Serach HaYachad, in that same document, it says that when there is a quorum of men together and they are going to have a meal, that before they have the meal, a priest is to begin by blessing first bread and wine. And so this has been extremely significant for understanding ideas of the Eucharist. They have another document, just to give you one more example, called the document of the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, which is an apocalyptic document of the end time that speaks of a cosmic battle between God and the good angelic world, along with the righteous, over against the fallen angelic world and the wicked. Very much like the kinds of things Jesus is said to have predicted for the future in his apocalyptic teachings. So another way, now none of them relate to what we might think of as Christian figures exactly. None of them tell of them. And some scholars have thought that they do, but it's very unlikely. But they give context. And so that's just for Jewish literature, two major examples of the way Jewish literature furnishes context. And so scholars of the historical Jesus will be immersed in this kind of thing.
How are apocryphal texts, specifically the Gospel of Thomas, but there's many type of Gnostic or just ahistorical or much more later Gospels, so to speak. Are they used at all for historical Jesus research? And if so, how do they differ from especially the canonical Gospels?
There's much debate about this. Many scholars, perhaps most, now by apocryphal Gospels, apocryphal literature, what we're talking about is literature that may have been written around the same time as the canonical Gospels, maybe half a century later, but was never brought into the New Testament. And so they're called apocryphal. Many scholars will think that they are too late to be of use to study of the historical Jesus, and also that they are derived, that anything they say about Jesus could be traced back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Therefore, you're not getting an independent source, you're getting a derived source that might be from the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th centuries. There are a number of scholars, however, that will say one, two, or a couple of them are useful. The scholar most prominent in this regard is named John Dominic Crossley. And he was a member of the Jesus Seminar back in the 1990s and has really been one of the most prominent voices in historical Jesus research. And one of his distinctives is that he considers at least 3 of the apocryphal Gospels to be of use. One is the Gospel of Thomas. And if there's any apocryphal text that any historical Jesus scholar might consider, it's the Gospel of Thomas, and I'll tell you why in just a second. But he will also use a work that's really categorized under a group known as the Apostolic Fathers. It's called the Didache, the Teaching of the 12 Apostles. It's actually a manual of church order preceded by a catechism of sorts. And then he will also use an apocryphal gospel called the Gospel of Peter. And that's only preserved, the only parts of that preserved are from Jesus' trial to his resurrection appearances. But Crossley finds parts of it that he thinks are useful. He believes it goes back to an earlier gospel that was independent of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. But let me tell you most about the Gospel of Thomas. The full text of this was discovered in 1945 in a 4th century Coptic manuscript from a place in Egypt known as Nag Hammadi. In Nag Hammadi, there was a discovery similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it was of a Christian Gnostic group. And 52, if I'm correct, 52 tractates in Coptic were found there. Among them, and by the way, among them was found copies of Plato's Republic. The Platonism, by this time Neoplatonism, plays a great deal in a significant role in this Gnostic type of Christianity. But also was found the Gospel of Thomas. Prior to that, however, it had been known from another find in Egypt at a place called Oxyrhynchus that there were Greek fragments of the Gospel of Thomas that predated it, perhaps by a century, into the 3rd century. The attraction of the Gospel of Thomas for historical Jesus scholars it's manifold, but let me give you give you two of the major reasons. One is it's very much like the hypothesized gospel that I previously mentioned called Q. Let me just circle back to that for a second. Q can be considered Matthew and Luke minus Mark. That is, the parts of Matthew and Luke that agree with each other but are not found in the Gospel of Mark. When all of that is distilled, quite interesting is that by and large, everything in that Q gospel are simply sayings. And this is one of the reasons it's called the Q sayings source. That is, it's not a narrative. It's rather almost a grocery list of things Jesus said. And that's what people consider Q to be. And so Q would have been considered to have been written perhaps 50s, 60s alongside Mark. The Gospel of Thomas itself is a sayings gospel. And so by its very format, by its very genre, it's like what scholars have envisioned Q to be. And so there's been an excitement among some to say, maybe we have not Q itself, but another document like Q. Maybe there were collections of sayings of Jesus going around before they were put in narrative form by Matthew and Mark and Luke. And so that's one. The other is in many of the sayings, they are similar enough to the sayings of Jesus, particularly in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but different enough that for some they ring as being independent testimony to what Jesus was saying, rather than derived testimony. That is, there's enough of a difference where some scholars are convinced that they're not just paraphrasing the Gospel of Mark here, that whoever wrote the Gospel of Thomas knew this independently of Mark, and it only differs because their memories differed on what Jesus was saying, or they heard Jesus saying those things at two different times with two different twists. So for Crossley and for others, that particular apocryphal gospel is often brought in along with Mark and Q. In fact, the Jesus Seminar, which was very prominent and active in the 1990s, in their book called The Five Gospels, included Thomas along with the canonical Gospels in their assessment. So that's, I don't know if I've covered everything that you were looking for in the question, but that's essentially where things are at with regards to apocryphal literature and this historical views.
Thank you so much. We'll move into a little bit more general Q&A, especially
Sure.
work that you do. In what ways is Jesus radically Jewish? Asked another way, in what ways do people simply take for granted when reading the Gospels how Jewish Jesus really was?
I can give you an example, but let me tell you again some backstory. In the 1980s, there was a movement, really it's traced to a figure who was at Duke University and then Oxford University named E.P. Sanders. In fact, this is called by some the Sanders Revolution. It has both theological implications and also historical implications. And this was a move that more than happened before, though there were predecessors, but its influence has been tremendous since the 1980s. To see Jesus and all the figures of the earliest part of Christian origins within Judaism and to understand them that way. And And so historical Jesus research since then has begun to understand Jesus as some form of Second Temple Jewish figure. The problem is, however, that Second Temple Judaism was so diverse. We can't even begin to talk about the elements of Second Temple Judaism. It was so diverse, and the Gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke, lend themselves to so many aspects of that since then he's been considered Jewish in so many ways that some of them conflict with one another. Some will write about Jesus as a proto-rabbi. Some have written about him as a Jewish charismatic miracle worker. Some as a Pharisee. Some as an Essene, because there were three sects: Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes. Jesus is in debate with the first two, but never mentions debate with the third. Could that have been because he was Essene himself? There was apocalyptic Judaism, the idea of a seer getting a revelation a special revelation from God about the heavenly places, as well as the way this age is going to transition to the age to come. And in other words, the Sanders Revolution has maybe solved one problem by saying, okay, we need to understand Jesus within Judaism, but it's created more because we don't know which to do. But well, let me stop there and ask you if that answers your question, because I could give you an example of how Jesus is presented as a sage, which would be more or less a wise man scripture scholar, but just as an example. But
Sure. Examples are always great.
Okay. And actually, I present this in my class, both my classes on Second Temple Judaism and my classes on Christian origins. But one of the aspects of a Jewish sage, well, two aspects. One is that a sage, if you look even in the book of Proverbs, a sage was someone who assumed that when God created the world, when the Jewish God created the world, he did so in wisdom. Therefore, in both the natural world and society, except when humans mess it up, the human world and society, there is wisdom that permeates it. And the sage would be the person that could observe nature, or that could observe society, find the wisdom, abstract it, and then repackage it for human behavior. An example from Proverbs chapter 6. The sage says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard, considers its ways and be wise. Without having any chief or officer or ruler, it prepares its food in summer and gathers its sustenance in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard?" So by just looking at an anthill, the sage is the guy that can see the wisdom in what the ants are doing, the wisdom of God's creation, abstract it, and then teach that to his disciples. Now, Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6. "Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them." That's a Jewish sage. A few lines later, "Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin, yet I tell..." That's a sage. In fact, you could apply this to all of Jesus' parables. This is a Jewish scribal culture that we find in the Gospels, particularly the Synoptic Gospels. let me just stop there. I think that gives a taste enough, and this way you can move on to other questions that you want. But the idea is that this is the debate now: which kind of Jewish figure Jesus is? What kind of case can you make, and is he a combination of a lot of these?
Dovetailing that question and answer, more specifically, how in line to Judaism was Jesus's teachings and message? I guess asked in another way, how Jewish is the gospel of Jesus?
In the way Jesus is presented, at least in the Synoptic Gospels, he is entirely in line with some aspect of Judaism during the Second Temple period. For instance, just continue. I could actually just expand on what I was saying about sage to illustrate that. The sages that began as observers of nature and society eventually became scripture scholars, because during the Second Temple period, and this is from the 6th century BCE all the way to the 1st century CE, during that period, the Hebrew Bible was being developed. And as it came to be developed around the second, almost to its full, around the 2nd century BCE, these sages, instead of just observing nature and society, also began to be observers of this emerging scripture. We know this from a work, this is from a corpus called the Old Testament Apocrypha, a work called The Wisdom of Yeshua ben Sirach, or Yeshua ben Sirach. And in the opening, the grandson of Yeshua, in the opening prologue, says, "Many teachings have been given to us through the law, the prophets, and the other writings that follow them." That's a way of speaking of the Hebrew Bible that's developing. "And for these we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. Now those who read the scriptures must not only themselves understand them, but must also, as lovers of learning, be able through the spoken word and written words to help the outsiders. So my grandfather Yeshua, who had devoted himself especially to the reading of the law, the prophets, and the other books of our ancestors, was himself also led to write something pertaining to wisdom and instruction." And so what you have is laity, people who are not priests, actually becoming scripture scholars. To look further at the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7, and I just had quoted Matthew 6 before, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment.' But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. If you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, 'You fool,' you will be liable to the hell of fire." Now, this is Jesus as a sage who's not only looking at nature and society, but also looking at scripture. And to your specific question, it may sound as if he's contravening Judaism at that time, but all he's doing is giving his take on what it means to obey this commandment. He's teaching how do you observe, "Thou shalt not murder." Now, his take is that it starts in the heart, but there's nothing non-Jewish about that. He's just in debate with other Jewish sages that would say differently, saying it's a matter of the heart. That's not a Christian teaching over against the Jewish teaching. That is just one particular Jewish sage's take on that commandment. And with the next one, you heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery. I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed." Again, he's basically saying the observance of the commandments starts with emotional disposition. So that's just an example that, at least in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, 90% of the time, if not more, you can find Jesus squarely within Second Temple Judaism.
You almost sort of alluded to it already in that example, but are there any specific rabbinic sayings that seem parallel, or perhaps Jesus is straight up quoting
Yes,
in the
yes.
Gospels?
The one that I had wanted to go through, there's a rabbinic work that stands the most chance of finding those. Now, the rabbis would have emerged. This is what we're talking about, the formalized rabbis who are called rabbi as a title. They would have emerged at the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, and they really inaugurate the next generation, the next phase of Jewish history, the rabbinic period, which would run from about 70 CE to 1050 CE. The first work that they produced was produced, as far as we can tell, in the beginning of the 3rd century CE, called the Mishnah. That work itself is highly technical legal disputes. However, there's one tractate in it called Pirkei Avot. It was actually a tractate written much later, but it's been added into it. The Chapters of the Fathers, where you have sayings of rabbis that are more along the lines of practical wisdom, religious practical wisdom, the kind you would expect to see of Jesus in the Gospels, than what you would get elsewhere in the Mishnah. That's all to say, I had wanted to scour through that. I just didn't have the time. I had wanted to scour through that again to see. But one that's famous is what's known as the Golden Rule. Jesus says, again, quoting him from the Sermon on the Mount, "In everything do to others as you would have them do unto you, for this is the law and the prophets." First, there's a Second Temple text known as Tobit, where something similar is said by this figure Tobit when he's instructing his son on wisdom, which is, "And what you hate, do not do to anyone." Similar to the kind of thing you get with Jesus in Matthew 7. But also in a later rabbinic work known as the Babylonian Talmud, there is ascribed to Hillel, who would have been a figure in the generation prior to Jesus. It's ascribed to Hillel the saying, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole Torah." And so if I'm getting at the gist of your question here, which is very good, is if there is something distinctive about Jesus' teaching in the Gospels, for instance, like the Sermon on the Mount, it's not so distinctive that it doesn't have parallels within Judaism. It's a matter of what his take is on it and the way he would, and I haven't analyzed these three or compared and contrast, but it would be the take he has and the context into which he puts it. For instance, in Matthew 7, everything is related to the kingdom of heaven, which is at hand, engus. And so for Jesus, unlike probably Hillel or Tobit, all this has to do with your lifestyle in light of the fact that we're about to transition into a new age. That would be the distinctive part. But there are many things that you can find in Jesus' teaching that are very similar to what you would find in the sages and scribes of Judaism in the 1st century.
Did Jesus speak any other languages besides, assumingly, Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, maybe even Latin?
Jesus is assumed to speak Aramaic because Aramaic came into Palestine with the Persians in the late 6th century BCE. That was the lingua franca, or at least the professional language used in Persia, and that was the language that had been established in Judea and all the regions of Palestine from the Persian period on. Greek had come in with the Hellenization of that time by Alexander the Great in the late 4th century. And it's assumed, to go back to your assumption, it's assumed that Jesus at least knew Aramaic because in the Synoptic Gospels in particular, there are times when, even though the language is Greek, the narrative will have Jesus speaking syllables, which only make sense if they're Aramaic. For instance, when he's healing a little girl, he for some reason it has Greek letters, but the phonology of it is Aramaic, Talitha kum, which means little girl, rise up. And so it's usually assumed that he would have had Aramaic. As far as Greek, there is no evidence like that we have, and many people have thought that because Jesus would have grown up in Galilee, in a rural area, he would not have been in a Hellenized section, and therefore would not have grown up growing Greek. However, because of some archaeological finds, such as the city nearby Nazareth called Sepphoris, it's been found that there was a lot of cosmopolitanism going on, at least in the vicinity around Nazareth. And for that reason, some speculate that Jesus likely, in order just to get by as a woodworker, would have known some Greek. As far as Hebrew or Latin, those are less likely, possible, but less likely. Latin at this time was not even spoken by the Romans in their official language, or I mean in their professional work. That would have been spoken among themselves, but it had not permeated the Mediterranean world yet. It was still reserved for Italy and Rome, and would not come into prominence for a few centuries. And Hebrew was usually known by the elite, but Jesus' profile, as far as we know, doesn't have him as being an elite. So it may not be that he knew Hebrew. In fact, to go back to that Sermon on the Mount, when he's talking about the commandments on murder and on adultery, he says, "You have heard that it was said," which means that the culture in which he was working was oral, and that would likely more be Aramaic than it would be Hebrew. This is what people knew. They would have heard it in synagogue in Aramaic.
What did the Passover lamb sacrifice look like during Jesus's time? And did it change much throughout the Second Temple period as a whole?
There is a rabbinic tradition, and this is in that work called the Mishnah that I just mentioned before. This would have been compiled in the 3rd century CE, so we're talking about 2.5 centuries after Jesus. There's a tractate in it called Pesachim, which is debates on law concerning Passover. Pesachim, the Passovers. And in the 10th chapter of that tractate, it speaks of the Passover Seder as being celebrated with 4 cups of wine in succession. In Luke's version of Jesus' Last Supper, it has Jesus not just blessing 1 cup of wine, but 2, one at the beginning of the meal and one at the end. And commentators have often thought that those are 2 of the 4, and that the Passover Seder would have had 4 cups, and this is what Jesus would have been celebrating. And the narrative just tells 2 of those cups as related to the inauguration of the Eucharist. That's possible, but inasmuch as the first we hear of that tradition comes in Mishnah, one needs to be a bit cautious about tracing it back. It very well could be, but you might need a little bit more evidence than that as far as what Passover would have looked like. I'll tell you what the real change would have been, and that is the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Now, in the history of Second Temple Judaism, there had been wars from 323 BCE, the death of Alexander the Great, all the way to 31 BCE, which was an event called the Battle of Actium, where Octavian, later to become Augustus, defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII. The wars were started because Alexander III, Alexander the Great, died. His would-be successors started warring among themselves, kingdom against kingdom, alliance against alliance. When Rome got involved, they started fighting in those wars, but they also had their own civil wars between consuls and proconsuls that complicated all of that. And it didn't all end until the Roman peace, Pax Romana, in 31 BCE. Now, one of the peculiarities, the distinctives of Judaism is that sacrifice, a Passover sacrifice, to be legitimate could only occur if it's done in the Jerusalem temple. During that period of war, Jews were hard-pressed around the Mediterranean and even the ancient Near East to get there, to offer the Passover sacrifice. You would have had Jews from Judea who could do it, Jews from Galilee, but it would be very difficult. And in fact, through the wars, enslavement, conscription into the military, Jews were being dispersed away from Jerusalem, not being invited to it. So to answer your question about what would have been distinctive about Passover sacrifice in Jesus' time is, for the first time in centuries, Jews could get to Jerusalem to celebrate it. And you find this, again, referring back to what I mentioned before, the Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, talks about the thousands upon thousands of pilgrims that would be there for every Passover. This would have been the novel aspect of Passover, that Jews could actually be there to have the priest make that sacrifice at the appointed time on the 14th day of Nisan, and then eat that meal.
What do we as modern audiences take for granted when reading the Gospels about the rabbis and Second Temple Judaism culture in general? I guess, asked another way, rabbis, especially the Pharisees and Sadducees, are looked at very negatively throughout the Gospels. Temple obviously is given a much lesser, for lack of a better word, stance there. Most of Jesus's time is in northern Galilee, and when he comes to the temple, it's a very critical. He's critiquing a lot of it. So what do we not get as modern audiences about rabbis and Second Temple Judaism that you just want to maybe parse over or correct the record?
There might be many, but I don't think I'm wrong in saying that it's easy, and especially in light of Protestant Christian teaching, it's easy to see the Jews as a legalistic foil to the grace brought about by Jesus. And that is, once again, the Gospel of Matthew seems to be made for this kind of understanding. You've got Jesus teaching things like the solution to keeping yourself from murder is in the heart, don't be angry. The solution to adultery is in the heart, don't lust. You have Jesus, in a sense, almost looking like a pietist, a Protestant pietist, saying religion is a matter of the heart. And then you've got Pharisees, Sadducees, that are concerned with details of the law. But two things on this that could be kept in mind. First of all, the law itself, and even Paul would agree with this. At least Paul would agree with this up until the time of Jesus, because Paul believed that the law had a purpose up until the time of Jesus. This is from Galatians chapter 3 and 4. That the law itself and its strictures, so to speak, was itself a response to what was considered deliverance. When you look at the opening of the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord thy God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Then come the commandments and all the other legal aspects. Therefore, so the strictures of the law are a response to, if you will, the grace and the mercy of God, a covenant response. You have done this for us, and so we will live like this for you. Now when that's taken in that sense, that's not legalism. Despite the way narratives could look within the Gospels. So in a sense, and not that Jewish scholars would agree with this, but in a sense, I'll tell you what I mean by that. There's grace in law. Now, what I mean by Jewish scholars having an issue with it, we don't want to say, don't worry. We don't want to say to the Jews, don't worry, your religion is like ours. Your religion is as Christian as ours is. You have nothing to worry about. So I don't mean this in a patronizing way, but there is a sense, and a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, a Jewish scholar would likely phrase it differently than what I'm doing. But there is a sense in which the mercy of God has come first, and this is a loving relationship. But on the other hand, all of the so-called grace that one sees in either in the portrayal of Jesus is in fact meant to help keep at least the moral aspect of the law. And so this referring to Paul, when he speaks of the fruit of the Spirit, he's talking about dispositions of the mind and heart that will make it impossible to break the Jewish law. Against such there is no law. But also on that, at least in the portrayal, once again in Matthew, it seems to be where we're camped here. When Jesus is in debate with the Pharisees, he's not necessarily telling them that their law, that their legal observance is wrong. He's telling them that their priorities need to shift. For instance, one of the great debates he has in Matthew is in chapter 23. And just quoting verse 23 from chapter 23, he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You tithe mint, dill, and cumin," and that is tithing everything you have, all of the kind of spices you can think of, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. But then he goes on, "It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others." So when he's telling them to have more mercy, he's not telling them to discard observance of what Christians might call the ceremonial law. He's just saying you need to up your game when it comes to mercy and justice, but don't stop tithing mint and dill and cumin. So, so in answer to your question, there's mercy in law, and there's law in grace.
Sounds like a bit of your pastoral work is coming out, which I appreciate.
Okay. It's been a while since I've done that kind of stuff. That's good to hear. Thank you.
How does the Greek language and its use, also just known as writing style, differ among the Gospels? And what can that tell us about each writer?
All of the Greek would be considered a type of Greek called koine. It means common Greek, but it by no means means unsophisticated Greek. It has a lot of levels depending upon who would have been speaking it and how they were trained. When you read the Greek in the Gospels, say of Mark and perhaps Matthew, and I have to say here, I have not done a lot of work, so I'm going to be cautious, a lot of work in this area, so I'm going to be cautious. But particularly in Mark, you have a Greek that is almost the Greek of somebody who learned it as a second language. I spoke earlier about the idea that sometimes within, for instance, the Gospel of Mark, you would have Jesus saying Aramaic words with Greek letters. That actually goes much broader in the Gospel Greek into what are broadly called Aramaisms. That is, not only do you see Greek Aramaic words in Greek letters, but sometimes you find what would be Aramaic syntax and grammar, even though you've got Greek words and Greek words in succession with one another. You have a writing that seems to have been someone who grew up perhaps knowing Aramaic, learned Greek, and has a proficiency gained on a casual level, has a proficiency in Greek to communicate with it, but hasn't been trained in a gymnasium, hasn't been trained by reading Homer, and so with Mark and perhaps Matthew, that's the kind of Greek you get. Not so when you get to the Gospel of Luke, and the author of the Gospel of Luke also wrote the Acts of the Apostles. Right from the start, you can see that the writer of the Gospel of Luke has been formally trained in Koine Greek, and both with vocabulary, syntax. Not that there aren't Jewish elements in there, and Lucan scholars now are beginning to see more Jewish aspects of the language and of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. But this person was trained. You need to know your Greek if you're going to get into the Gospel of Luke and look at Jesus. It's a much broader vocabulary, much more generous use of participles and extended subordinate clauses. This person knows how to write in a more sophisticated Greek. If you're interested in the Gospel of John, there's something unique to the Gospel of John that is different. The Greek in a lot of parts of the Gospel of John is the kind that you would get in Mark and Matthew. It's not as sophisticated as what you get in Luke. It's more kind of the Greek that's learned as a second language. However, there's something about the community that wrote the Gospel of John, and this also occurs in the three epistles that are ascribed to John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. They had a certain parlance, a certain way of speaking theologically and devotionally to one another and to others about things that has a number of peculiarities that can be traced perhaps best to Semitic poetry. First of all, on purpose, the language is very limited. On purpose, there are simple predications. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. And in Greek, it goes, God was the Word. All of these, what are known as copulative sentences, using the verb to be or the verb to become, very simple predications over and over. And often there's a chain link quality to it, where the theme that ended the previous sentence begins the next sentence. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. And as I mentioned in the Greek, God was the Word. So that it's almost like a chain link where the next sentence picks up where the last left off in a dovetail kind of thing, and then moves on. And you can find this sort of thing in Semitic poetry, where the idea is the way you layer your clauses one upon another. And so, because this is unique to John, this is one of the reasons scholars will rarely go to John to find out what Jesus' actual words were, because Jesus' words are conveyed through this parlance that was developed in the Johannine community, which is fine, and it's intriguing. It's usually called the Johannine sociolect or dialect. But it's fine and intriguing, and doesn't mean there's no truth in it. But if you're trying to look at the way Jesus actually spoke, he speaks more like a Second Temple Jewish figure in Matthew, Mark, and Luke than he does in John. So anyway, that would give you a sense of the type of Greek that we have in the canonical Gospels.
Jesus seems to be crucified on a different day in the Gospel of John than in the Synoptics.
Yeah.
Assuming that's so, which I think is pretty well known, or if not well known, it's well known in academic or apologetic circles. If so, is that a problem for Christianity in a historical consistency sense, or is that more of a problem for modern audiences not understanding the nuances of the Greco-Roman bios?
Here I'm going to grind an axe. Your question goes to something in my wheelhouse. So just to clarify, so that everyone's on the same page. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Passover Eve is the night of the Last Supper. The Last Supper is considered a Passover meal. And so the next day when Jesus is crucified, it's not Passover. It's what's known as the first day of the next feast that comes right after Passover, called the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or in Hebrew, Matzot. And so in the Synoptics, Jesus eats his final meal on Passover and is crucified on the first day of Matzot, of unleavened bread. Not so in the Gospel of John. There's clear evidence that when Jesus is eating his final meal, they're still in preparation for the Passover that will happen the next day. And so in John, Jesus is crucified just as the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. Going back to what I mentioned about for thousands of people now in Jerusalem. So in the Gospel of John, there is a narrativization of what Paul had said in 1 Corinthians 5, Christ our Passover. Jesus is the Passover. So the idea is that a problem? Now, I'm going to refer to an early document, which we call the Muratorian Canon. In the first couple of centuries, there were various drafts of what the New Testament books should look like, what should be in, what should be out. And we eventually arrived at the 27 we have now by the middle of the 4th century. We have a couple of those drafts, however, and this Muratorian Canon is one of them, where presumably bishops were spitballing what should be in it. Now, in this, the first are listed the 4 Gospels that will make it into the canon: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We presume that Matthew and Mark were in it, but that part of the manuscript has been lost, and it picks up with Luke and then goes with John. And then there's a pause, and the person or persons writing it say this. I'm going to quote it. And so, though various elements may be taught in the individual books of the Gospels, a way of saying, though there might be possible contradictions, nevertheless, this makes no difference to the faith of believers, since by the one sovereign Spirit all things have been declared in all the Gospels, concerning the nativity, concerning the passion, concerning the resurrection, concerning life with his disciples, and concerning his twofold coming, the first and second coming of Christ at this point. So what he's saying is, we're not too worried about the differences that we notice in the gospel. And one of them, doubtless, was the day on which Jesus is crucified. Because we are only concerned to the degree they support and give life to our creeds. Do they speak of Jesus' birth, the nativity? Do they have him suffering, the passion? Do they have him rising from the dead, the resurrection? His life with his disciples? Do they have him coming a first time and promising to come a second time? This was developing in the creeds, which you can trace at least back to Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century CE, where the Orthodox, what would later be called the Orthodox Catholic branch of Christianity, were developing what they believed to be the right way of believing in Jesus over against the wrong way. Those creeds were developing, and as the bishops were also developing a New Testament, their primary concern was, do these works support our creeds? So the Moratorian canon says there may be various elements taught in the individual books, but so long as during worship, our presbyters can preach resurrection, can preach second coming, can preach nativity, we're not concerned with the details of those differences. A problem comes, and this some might disagree, but here's the axe that I wanted to grind. The problem comes when you remove or minimize the creeds, and you say, no, now the Bible is my creed. Now that's something that was never being considered when the New Testament was being formulated. Because now, if the Bible or if the New Testament is your creed, now you have a creed that teaches various elements in the different books. And so it's not that difficulty can't be resolved, but it's a problem that was not faced in late antiquity when the New Testament was being put together.
You've already touched on our next two questions, but we'll flesh them out more accordingly. Was John the Baptist ever part of the Qumran community?
This has been thought because of that discovery I mentioned earlier, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly. And here are some features that have made people think that John might have been a disenfranchised member of that sectarian community at Khirbet Qumran on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. One is, once again, to repeat myself, and this has been noticed by a Johannine scholar, Andreas Obermann. The verse Isaiah 40, verse 3, in the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. That, as far as we know, that was not considered a messianic text. It's not widespread in Second Temple Judaism and Christianity as something that people in the first century thought needed to be fulfilled. But we do find it as a text that people thought needed to be fulfilled in two places. One is the canonical Gospels for John the Baptist. The other is in the sectarian documents at Khirbet Qumran. Give as brief context as possible. In the eighth column of a document known as the Serach HaYachad, in the eighth column of one that's the manuscript, the copy that was found in the first cave, it talks about there must be a group of 3 priests and 12 laymen. For 2 years, they are to observe Torah faithfully. And if they do so for 2 years, they transform into a living temple. And this is interesting because of the temple imagery. And this, we're talking about a century and a half before Jesus. Once they do, then they are given, and I'm skipping over a lot of detail here, they are given a task, and the task is defined by Isaiah 43. This is what they are supposed to be doing in the wilderness. Now, for them, they define it right after in a sentence that says, what does it mean to prepare a way in the wilderness? It's Midrash Torah. It is the study and observance of Torah, with the hope that as they do so, they will bring God to restore the Jerusalem temple to what it should have been, because they believed it was corrupt. And here you have the same thing being used for John the Baptist. So that's one. Another is, in the Gospels of Mark and particularly Matthew, John the Baptist is considered to be preaching in the wilderness of Judea. The wilderness of Judea is west and south of Khirbet Qumran, that same area. And so if you're going to take the Matthew and Mark and that geography for the location of John the Baptist and where he was at the Jordan River, the Jordan River is right at the mouth by Khirbet Qumran. He's right in that area. A third thing is that among the sectarians, and in this document that I've been referring to, the Serach HaYachad, they associated their ablutions, baptisms, with the Holy Spirit. I won't take the time to quote it, but it comes in in that same document. They associate the water of baptism with the pouring out of the Spirit of God. And this is John the Baptist saying, I baptize you with water. Coming after me is someone who will baptize you by the Spirit. So that's just 3. Now, that has been breaking down, however. We, a year or so ago, we in the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus, we reviewed a recent work on John the Baptist by Joel Marcus, who made again the case of John perhaps being an ex-member of this sect. And the reviewers had questions about this aspect of his thesis. A couple of things, just to give you an idea of how that construct is breaking down. In the study of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is less and less certainty that this sect actually lived in Khirbet Qumran on that northwest corner. And so to say that John would have been part of it and then somehow disenfranchised of it makes less sense in light of what Qumran scholars are thinking of that group. A second is that, to refer back to something I mentioned earlier, in the Gospel of John, which is now being taken more seriously for historiography, in the Gospel of John, John the Baptist doesn't go into any wilderness places. He's located at 2 places. One is Anon, which is on the west bank of the Jordan, but far north, almost into Galilee. And then another place called Bethany beyond Jordan, which is midway between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee on the east bank of the Jordan River. And there is an important article by a scholar at King's College London, Joan Taylor, who notes that neither of those places are wilderness places. And they very well may have been the places where John was baptizing. So just to give you a sense, without trying to get into the tall grass, that there was a strong sense of John the Baptist being somehow related to the sectarians at Qumran. It's now breaking down.
What did the TaNaKh look like in the time of Jesus? What books were included in the first century, which we've already touched on? Asked a different way, how does the TaNaKh reflect a more Protestant or Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Old Testament in the time of Jesus?
What you're talking about is the Hebrew version of the Bible, not the Greek. And the medieval name that came to be, or the epithet that came to be used, or the acronym, is TaNaKh. And it's because it has three parts: Torah, in Hebrew, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and so we're talking about the Hebrew Bible. This was developing during the Second Temple period, as far as we can tell. Early on, we hear about Torah, but soon, by the time we get to the 2nd century BCE, we hear about Torah and Nevi'im, law and prophets. And then even by the middle or end of that 2nd century into the 1st, we hear about all three parts. Actually, in the excerpt that I quoted to you from Yeshua ben Sirach, the sage, of there being law, prophets, and writings. So it is in process as Jesus is a public figure. It will not be so-called canonized. It will not be finalized until we get to the rabbis after the destruction of the temple. And we don't know precisely how this was done. All we know is this. At that point, they were debating whether to keep 5 books in their canon, which were Ezekiel, Proverbs, Kohelet, that is the Ecclesiasticus, the Song of Songs, and Esther. And it seems like those debates fizzled out and they just decided to leave them in there. But what we know, what we surmise at the time of Jesus is it seems like Torah and the prophets were in place, but the writings were still being developed. And we know this from one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is from the 11th cave that yielded scrolls. It's known as the Psalm Scroll. Its official title is 11Q Psalms A. But it's an early copy from around the 1st century BCE, CE. I check me on that, of the Psalter. Now, in it has many, if not most, of the Psalms that would end up going into the Hebrew Psalter, but not all of them, and not in the same order. I think not all of them, certainly not in the same order. And it also includes some Psalms and hymns that will ultimately not be in the Hebrew Bible. So from the Psalm scroll, it's been surmised that at the time of Jesus, everything was just about cooked to perfection, but not there yet. And with that Hebrew Bible, it would not have included what would later be called the Old Testament Apocrypha. And so your question about Protestant or Catholic, the Protestant Old Testament canon was very much driven by the Renaissance motto of go ad fontes, go back to the original sources, go to the sources. So even though the Greek had been used up until that point, Protestants said, no, Hebrew was original to Greek, so we'll go back to the TaNaKh, which did not include the Apocrypha. And so that the Hebrew would have been more like what the Protestants adopted. Now, as far as the Catholic side, with the Catholic Bible will entertain and consider the Apocrypha to be part of it. These were Greek writings. One or two of them may have had Hebrew or Aramaic originals, but it's about 13 writings that were primarily only written in Greek and rejected by the rabbis, primarily for that reason. And they end up coming in, the one who really solidifies them as being a part of the Christian canon was a figure named Origen, who was a scholar in Alexandria and then in Caesarea in the late 2nd into the 3rd centuries CE. And famously in a letter to a colleague named Africanus, he speaks about divine providence bringing those Greek works into being, and that they needed to be included. So that would make for your difference. While the Catholic Bibles will appreciate the Hebrew, they will also have respect to the Greek canon that emerged.
Well, Dr. Daise, thank you so much for coming on Church Coffee and talking historical Jesus in this round table of different questions. Very exciting, very interesting. What's next for you? Do you have another book coming out soon, or are you just coasting on good tenure and enriching students' minds?
Well, I'm very much enjoying students, actually now more than ever, and I'm doing that. But I'm working now. I've just published a book on quotations in the Gospel of John, and I published a co-edited volume of the use of Jewish scripture in early Judaism and Christianity. I'm involved with co-editing a volume now from the Catholic Biblical Association on the use of the Old Testament Jewish scriptures in the Gospel of John. But my own work has been something I've wanted to get to for a long time. The years immediately after the crucifixion, this John Dominic Crossley that I mentioned to you earlier called them the lost years. They're often called the years between Jesus and Paul, which doesn't make any sense. But this period was formative, but it's challenging. And I've been wanting to get to this actually for decades. So I've been delivering papers at places, and I'm working on a monograph to revisit that in light of things that have been occurring in studies of Jewish migration and Jewish pilgrimage that can explain more richly what's happening, for instance, in Acts 2 and the nations being present in Jerusalem at the Feast of Pentecost and things such as that. So it's going to be a while because I'm chairing the department and they don't seem to want to let me spend as much time as I want to do that. But that's what I'm working on. And I have completely enjoyed this. Thank you so much for the invitation. I was honored and humbled by it. So I hope something will be of use to your listeners.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words, Dr. Daise, and we'll see everyone next week for another episode of Church Coffee. Our album art was done by my wife, and our theme music was composed by TJ Stokes.